Huh? That's weird. It's like something out of that Twilighty show about that zone.
Hi, everybody, and welcome to the Springfield Googleplex, the movie podcast for Simpson fans, brought to you by thatshelf.com. Each week, we talk about a movie parodied on The Simpsons. Maybe it was The Simpsons that introduced us to the film, or maybe when we finally saw it, we realized, hey, that's where that Simpson joke came from. Regardless, each week we pick one that one of us hasn't seen or hasn't seen in a while, watch it, and come together to discuss. I'm your host, Adam Scholes, and joining me as always is the John Lithgow to my horrifying airplane gremlin, my co-host, Nate Storing. How are you today, my friend?
I'm good. I feel like I've entered another dimension, a dimension of sound, a dimension of sight, a dimension of mind.
Yeah, well, if that wasn't clue enough, and again, I don't know why I do this every time. I'm like, if that wasn't a clue, it's in the title of the episode. You know what you're gonna... Okay, but before we talk about that, this week, we are joined by a very special guest. He's a fellow Canadian writer about film, TV, and pop culture, and the co-host of the Awesome Friday podcast. It's Matthew Simpson. Welcome to the show, Matthew.
Yay, thank you for having me. It's very exciting to be here. I'm ready to unlock the door with the key of imagination.
Ooh.
Nice.
And now I can say, if it wasn't clear from all of these references, this week we watched the absolutely cursed 1983 horror anthology film Twilight Zone, the movie, which you might remember from such Simpson episodes as Season 3's Treehouse of Horror II, Season 5's Treehouse of Horror IV, and Season 10's Wild Bart's Can't Be Broken, and possibly Treehouse of Horror 9? As well as countless other references to the Twilight Zone TV show over the years, like To Serve Man in Season 2's Treehouse of Horror, Living Doll in Season 4's Treehouse of Horror 3, Person or Persons Unknown in Season 5's Marge on the Lamb, The Shelter in Season 6's Bart's Comet, Eye of the Beholder in Season 6's Homie the Clown, Little Girl Lost in Season 7's Treehouse of Horror 6, The Little People in Season 8's Treehouse of Horror 8... Seven. Yeah, there's a lot of Roman numerals for me to keep track of here. The Old Man in the Cave in Season 8's, I'm not even going to attempt to do that, but it's the one where Homer eats the spicy chili one. My Spanish is not good. Nate, do you want to?
That's okay. I've done that
good.
once.
Okay, yep. And the Twilight Zone in general in Season 12's New Kids on the Block. Now, before we get into all of that, though, we want to get to know you, Matthew. Or Matthew, Matt, what do we prefer?
You can call me Matthew. It's fine.
Okay, Matthew.
Professionally, I go by Matthew.
Yeah. Perfect. Well, and we're a very professional podcast here. We've got professional podcast mics, and
No.
So. But seriously, no. What's your history with The Simpsons? Was this a show that you grew up watching, or you came to later in life? What's your story?
Well, I'm in my 40s, which means I watched The Simpsons when it was new. So I have watched The Simpsons from the start until, I'm definitely guilty of watching it all the way through that sort of like golden age up to about season 12, and then sort of, I want to say like aging out of it, but at the same time, like it's sort of changing and me not changing with it, if that makes sense.
Right. Yeah, totally.
I'm of the opinion that The Simpsons didn't get bad. It just changed, and it changed away from my tastes. Like they tried to change to keep up with current generations, and that moved away from my sense of humor.
Interesting, yeah.
Because I think it's still a very well produced and acted show, and often very topical. So yeah, I've watched it my whole life, off and on. I have come back and watched the odd episode here and there. Usually they're fine, at least. I haven't seen a bad one in a long time. And then my most recent like deep dive into anything was about 4 years ago now. So it has been a minute, but about 4 years ago, I watched every single Treehouse of Horror that had been made up to that point.
Oh,
wow.
And ranked all the segments. There was 93 of them at that time. So it's been 4 years, so that makes, 12 more? So there'd be 105 of them now. And I've been afraid to, revisit the project. But
Understandably.
But yeah, I watched and ranked all 93 Treehouse of Horror segments in 2020.
Wow. And so what is number one on that list for you?
The Raven, obviously.
Okay, all right. Yeah. The Raven. Tell us more. What is it about The Raven that it's that sweet spot for you?
It's just a perfect adaptation. They brought in James Earl Jones for that whole episode, actually. He's most famous for that segment, but for that whole episode, to narrate a classic poem by my favorite poet as well. It's just a very pitch perfect moment on The Simpsons. I actually think it's one of the best things they've ever done. Like,
Wow.
not just Treehouse of Horror, but like in general.
It is amazing. The animation in that sequence.
I was just going to say,
truly
yeah,
amazing.
the design and look of
Yeah.
that segment is, bar none, probably, their high point.
Yeah. And then if you are curious at all, my number 2 and 3 are The Shining and Citizen Kang.
Okay.
Very
yeah.
nice.
Well, those are two.
Yes.
Yeah. I mean, The Shining is probably one of the, if you were to ask most fans, I think they would definitely rank that one up there pretty high.
Yeah.
Yeah, and
It's-
like I would say also in Citizen Kang, like I still to this day routinely say, "Don't blame me. I voted for Kodos."
Yeah, absolutely. I feel like The Shining is sort of one of the texts of this podcast too.
Yeah,
Just like it's one of the most recognizable movie parodies on The Simpsons, one of the ones that everyone I think remembers really, really well. Matthew, is there, as we say in our introduction, is there a movie that you saw and you were like, oh my God, that's that Simpsons joke? And like you sort of spotted a parody out in the wild.
So many over the years. But the first one of those was probably like every time they've done a Twilight. I watched all the Twilight Zone when I was a kid in reruns. So
Oh, nice.
every time they've done a Twilight Zone, I've been like, oh yeah, that's a good one.
Yeah. And they do it a lot. As we
So
found
much.
out.
Yeah, as we discovered.
Yeah. So much. The jokes that I find most funny aren't necessarily the ones that are from like a direct lift from a Twilight Zone, but they're often in those episodes. Like, I think the Genesis tub is a good
yeah.
one. That's a remake of I think it's called The Little People on the Twilight Zone. Anyway, and there's the great line in that episode where one of the little people says to Lisa, who is their god, like, "We have listened to you speak since the dawn of time, O Creator, and we've learned to imitate you exactly."
Yeah, that's right.
And I find stuff
Yeah.
like that really funny. I don't know why.
They always find really good opportunities within that broader premise to like insert their own sense of humor, which I love. And maybe that's a good segue to start talking a little bit about Treehouse of Horror II, which is the episode we decided to focus on for this movie, even though it has been parodied in a couple different episodes.
Well, and Twilight Zone, the movie, also gets referenced in Treehouse of Horror 4,
Right.
Is it, Nate? But
Yeah,
we're
yeah.
going to be we actually are talking about that one specifically in our next episode, so that's why we decided to focus on Treehouse of Horror 2 for today, which is season 3, episode 7, directed by Jim Reardon, written by Al Jean and Mike Reiss, Jeff Martin and George Meyer, Sam Simon and John Schwartzwelder. Original air date October 31st, 1991. And the wraparounds here are Homer, Bart, and Lisa eat too much candy and then all have bad dreams, and we get to see each one of their bad dreams. So Lisa has the monkey paw that grants wishes. Bart's dream is Bart has telekinetic powers, and then Homer's bad dream is that Mr. Burns creates a robot with his brain. But specifically, the Twilight Zone segment is really the Bart segment. It's sort of doing a loose parody of the Twilight Zone episode, It's a Good Life. And it, of course, opens with a Rod Serling-esque,
Presented for your consideration.
and ends with the
Quite a twist, huh? Bet you didn't see that one coming.
which, is very, very Twilight Zone-y. So I guess my question is, of course, as we always like to ask, why this? Why did they choose to parody, of all the Twilight Zone segments to pick, why do you think is this one specifically?
I mean, I think the short answer is that It's a Good Life is one of the most famous Twilight Zones. It's not one of my personal favorites, to be perfectly
Right.
clear. I think it's good, not great. And I actually think the version in the movie is better than the version in the show, which is a bit of a hot take, I think.
Interesting. Okay.
But it is one of the best known, often held up as one of the best episodes of the series. Like, if you were to look up top 10 or top 20 lists, I guarantee it would be on almost all of them.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I feel like also Bart is kind of the perfect casting for the Anthony role as well.
Yeah,
Of like, if you're
100%
going to
he
give
is.
if you're going to give a kid supernatural powers and they're going to become like a tyrant, Bart's probably the number one candidate for that.
Certainly, especially like this early in the show when Bart is sort of seen culturally as just like the demon hellspawn of Dennis the Menace. Like,
Right.
And it seems so tame in retrospect because, South Park comes along and then those kids become a parent's worst nightmare. But yeah, there was a time when like Bart Simpson was considered like this little hellion and, nobody would want a kid like Bart. And of course, obviously, as the show progresses, his character changes considerably. But I would say, yeah, like season 3, the idea of that Bart having telekinetic powers and running rampant with him. That's how you get probably one of my all-time favorite jokes in the show, which is the best Moe's Tavern crank call. I'm a stupid moron with an ugly face and a big butt, and my butt smells, and I like to kiss my own butt. I mean, and I did that off book, ladies and gentlemen.
Oh, wow.
That's just up there.
Oh, wow.
That's amazing.
No.
Yeah,
Big-
I love that.
big fan.
And also renaming America Bonerland is also pretty good. That's the kind of like crude humor that you would get in the earlier seasons.
Yeah.
That they just kind of don't do anymore. It's not clever. It's just like something that a kid would actually do, you know?
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, I think in the early days, especially, the kids were more like kids than they are now, right?
Yeah.
Like, they've been around for 36, Jesus, that's most of my life, 36 years. All the characters in that show are basically adults at this point, even if they're trapped in 10-year-old bodies.
Totally. Yeah. Bart and Homer at some point kind of become like a buddy cop, or, you know, like they're kind of just in it together in a lot of these things. Like I think about like Bart Carney is an episode where they're just kind of like, you know, they act like they're almost the same age and same level of intelligence and maturity. And I feel like it kind of evolved into that over time. But yeah, in this, Bart's really a kid, which is kind of fun.
Yeah. It's an interesting thing to chart. You guys are obviously watching a lot of The Simpsons. But like in 1989 or 90, when it was first coming out, like it was very much a reflection of the kind of sitcom that was popular in the 70s and 80s, the family in a home sitcom. And then it became, in late 90s and early zeros, it started to become more of the like Friends and Seinfeld type funny. And now it's closer to like more adult animated stuff, at least what I've seen has been. So it's an interesting way to watch the show evolve.
Well, I always joke that, you know, in those early years, the plots were pretty straightforward. And then I guess it's probably around like season 7 or 8, when the A act has absolutely nothing to do with the B and C act. It's like they kind of have like their own like little mini story off the top. And then, but if you were to just tell someone that, you know, here's what happens in the first 3 minutes of the episode, try and guess like where it heads, it would be nearly impossible, because 9 times out of 10 it's completely unrelated, which was not the case in those early days. But yeah, that's a really interesting assessment, Matthew, that I hadn't really thought about, is that it sort of did evolve as the popular cultural version of a sitcom sort of evolved. And in some ways, it also probably helped define those. Like, I'm sure things like Family Guy and Bob's Burgers and like all the animated sitcoms that come after it are definitely influenced by the direction that they took. But it's all very cyclical, which is pretty cool.
They've had to change to stay current, and there's lots of people now, mostly my age, who will tell you that the show is bad, and it's not bad. It wouldn't be on the air for 36 years if it was still bad, right?
Yeah.
It's just different now, and that's fine.
Well, and it's so funny because we talked to Bill Oakley last season, and, you know, he said the writers were all on the internet back when the show was originally airing, and he's like, they've been saying it's been bad since season 2. Like, the nerds on the internet always hate the show, except they keep watching it. These criticisms are nothing new. So I think you're right, though. I can't speak for you, Nate, but I think that's really a perfect way of putting my relationship with how I evolved with the show, is that the show changed and maybe I didn't change in the same way. And so we drifted apart. But
yeah, I think that's exactly right. And now it's like gone through probably multiple transformations. So it's like, you know, whatever we're at, season 36, like in the last couple seasons, people say are quite different than like what was there the seasons before that. So it's like at some point it may come full circle, and like I need to give it a shot again and see maybe it has changed yet again in a way that does appeal to me. You know, I was going through some of the recent seasons, just the intros for the last season are so creative, and they have like all these guests and different media and all this kind of stuff. They really took the couch gag to kind of a next level, and beyond just like the guest directors and things like that. Like they had Guillermo del Toro and stuff like that. But some of these are just like really cool ideas.
Well, I want to bring it back to the episode specifically. As you say, Matthew, like, because we've been watching a lot of Simpsons and digging so deep into it, you can very quickly start to see who the directors are. And I always know when it's a David Silverman episode, because like the animation style is so distinctly his. And I would say like this one does have a sort of Jim Reardon-esque look to sort of, I feel like his compositions, but also like some of his character designs. Like I love the Homer Jack in the Box character. That's just such a great image and such a great joke. But then also like when they cut to Krusty.
Well, it's still on. 346 consecutive hours. And all because of one little boy who won't let me stop!
Like his bloodshot eyes, and he's like unshaven, and it's just like it's such a good drawing.
Yeah.
Like, and he just looks awful. I mean, it was more sad than funny, but like it was just, again, it sort of speaks to this incredible visual style that this show, I think, maybe doesn't necessarily always get credit for. It's so much more than just like a cartoon. When they have those opportunity to flex their muscles, which the Treehouse of Horror episodes tend to be that opportunity because they're sort of breaking with tradition, breaking the canon. I love some of the imagery that they can come up with.
Yeah, totally. I mean, one of the things I love about this segment in particular is that they were able to kind of come up with their own Twilight Zone twist ending. Because, like, you know, we'll get into it with the movie, but the movie's version of this segment is different than the original in terms of the ending, and the Simpsons parody is also different than both of those. Right. But the idea that, like, Bart's sort of Twilight Zone existential terror is that he and his dad both say "I love you" to each other. I love that. That's where that sort of Twilight Zone premise goes, is that they just become closer because he turned him into a Jack-in-the-Box.
Then they spend actual time with one another for the first time at that point.
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
I mean, I also love this episode because it ended up being, and I didn't really realize this going into it, it's riddled with pop culture, movie, television references. Nate, you've sort of listed them out for us here if you want to run us through maybe just some of your favorites, because there's so many. Yeah.
I'll do like a quick rundown. So we have Frankenstein, of course, is the third segment with Homer as a robot. The first segment is not really a movie reference, but it's one of those stories that has been retold in many, many of these horror anthologies, is like the Twisted Claw or the Monkey Paw or some version of that. You have Bride of Frankenstein, of course, with Marge's hair. You have a couple references to The Wizard of Oz, which is quietly one of the most referenced movies on The Simpsons.
Yeah.
You have Mr. Burns humming If I Only Had a Brain, and then his insult to the robot. What was it? Like, you clanking, clattering cacophony of whatever. That's also from The Wizard of Oz.
Yeah.
The very beginning, you get a little glimpse of the kids from It's the Great Pumpkin, Charlie Brown, dressed up in their costumes. I think Maggie's even wearing the witch's mask from that as well.
Yes, I think that's right, yeah.
Yep. Bambi's mom is on one of the gravestones, of course.
Dark. They went a dark place there, yeah.
Forgot about that.
Yeah. You have Jasper when he is turned into a dog with a human face. Apparently that is actually from Invasion of the Body Snatchers, which I admittedly have not seen, but there is like a dog-human creature in that movie, apparently.
Okay.
Yeah, there is.
There you go. Homer's vision when he turns into a robot is basically the Terminator's vision, right? It's even actually the red, because we talked about this in our Westworld episode. They do the robot vision thing a whole bunch of times, and it's kind of always a mix of Westworld, RoboCop, and the Terminator. This one's the one that really tilts more into Terminator territory. The Thing with Two Heads, which is the ending where Burns' head is grafted onto Homer's body, is a parody of this, like, what would you call it? Like it's a B movie, maybe even an exploitation movie.
It's. Have you seen it?
No.
Oh, I have. It's a wild ride. And I'm not just saying that because they ride a motorcycle. But yeah, I think it would technically be considered a blaxploitation movie, but like it kind of defies classification. It is a weird movie.
Yeah. So we can add that one to the list of future watches, I think.
Yeah.
And then probably the deepest cut, because I don't think it's a movie that people really think about that much, is Midnight Express. The scene where Homer gets patted down when he's getting on the airplane and they find all of the souvenirs. It's in the first segment. That's apparently a parody of a scene in Midnight Express, which I think is about drug running.
Yeah,
Not a movie I know almost anything
Turkish
about.
Prison, yeah. It's a movie that I think is probably best known for its kick-ass soundtrack more than anything else.
There you go.
And the idea that like being thrown in a Turkish prison became like a cultural touchstone of like, don't do something bad, you don't want to end up in a Turkish prison. But I don't.
Oh, okay.
I've never seen it, but I know the score because it's Giorgio Moroder, and the opening theme of that movie kicks ass. It's probably playing right now in post because, you know, that's what I like to do.
Right.
But yeah, no, I mean, Matthew, this is the running thing on this show is that Nate loves the Treehouse of Horror episodes, and they're also the episodes that I tend to skip on my rewatches because...
Interesting.
Nate doesn't understand this logic, but it's
I'm gonna interrupt you and say I want you to explain. I'm also not going to understand.
Okay, so my philosophy is just that they're so Halloween-y that you got to be in October to watch them. Just like I wouldn't watch like a Christmas episode in the middle of August, I wouldn't watch a Halloween episode in the middle of August. So whenever I do rewatch them, I'm always like surprised by how much I enjoy them and how many great jokes there are, because I just haven't heard them like 1,000 times like I have with some of the other episodes. And this one has one of my all-time favorite jokes that is like one of my go-to like in real life quotes / references that I make. So my wife, she's a dance studio director, and whenever I go to dance competitions and I see something really impressive, I always like will lean into her and be like,
I can do that, but I don't want to.
I knew you were going to say that, and it's exact. I actually, that's another one that I use in real life all the time.
Yeah, exactly.
I'm pretty sure we all use that one in real
Yeah,
life.
exactly. It's so good.
That's one of those ones that might have even like achieved escape velocity, right? Where even people who didn't watch The Simpsons say it.
Yeah,
you know,
totally.
and they don't know it's from The
100% it
Simpsons.
is.
Yeah. I love those.
And again, the line reading on it is so spot on. Like Nancy Cartwright, just like she absolutely nails it. It's that perfect like 10-year-old kid kind of thing that you would say. And yeah, I love that line. So, is there anything else from this episode you guys want to talk about before we get into the movie?
I would be curious to hear just what your favorite joke. Like you just said, that is your favorite. My favorite joke from the whole episode is by far, your superior intellect is no match for our puny weapons.
That's great. Yeah.
So I'd be curious to hear what yours is too.
And by extension, soon they will make a board with a nail so big it will destroy them all. That's pretty good.
So good.
Yeah, there are a lot of good ones. It's hard to pick just one.
I also love the gag at the very beginning when Homer shows up with the monkey paw and he's like, I got it from that vendor right over there. And there's like a little dust cloud. He's like, oh no, wait, it's over there.
Yeah, I love that's. I love a classic. I love a classic fake out joke like that. I want again a line that I remembered and said before it like I did the thing of like I preempted it by like 5 seconds. Is the turkey's a little dry? Turkey's a little dry. Like again, it's not really a joke, but I love it. That like that's what Homer's upset about.
Yeah. Well, Adam, did you notice that the guy who sells them the monkey paw has the exact same voice as the guy who sells them the evil Krusty doll?
That's bad.
Even though it's a different racist stereotype.
That's good. Oh wait, no, flip that. Racist stereotype. That's bad.
That's bad.
Yes. The Frogurt is also cursed. Yes, I love that. No, and then another one of my favorite line readings, because I just love when Mr. Burns gets to be silly, is when Nate, you have this written down, but it's one of my favorite parts is when he puts Homer's brain on his head.
Look at me, I'm Davy Crockett.
Davy Crockett.
I think that's probably my favorite joke, because that one just kills me.
It's so out of character for him, and that's what I love about it.
How many of these have you guys watched? So the Treehouses in particular, how many of you watched for the show?
Not that many yet, because we've done. I think we've done 3. Is that right? We did Nightmare on Elm Street. Yeah. We did Dave the Dolphin. Yeah. We did King Kong.
Yeah.
I think that's it.
Well, so the reason I ask our next episode.
And our next episode, yes.
So the reason I ask is that there is a recurring joke in these episodes that I love, which is Mr. Burns and Smithers having a bet, and Mr. Burns saying, you owe me a Coke.
I've never noticed that.
Me neither. Yeah. I love that.
It happens I think it's the first time it happens is in this one, when Homer like wakes up and he goes, oh, he's alive. You owe me a Coke.
There you go.
I love that. I had never noticed that.
Yeah. Now that's something that we'll have to keep track of, Nate.
Yeah. I have another sort of like Simpsons connection that I'd never noticed before. So, you know the meme of Bart hitting Homer over the back with a chair?
Yeah.
Homer almost does the same thing to Bart in this episode.
Oh.
So, like, I wonder if it's actually an intentional callback. I think that's in season 8, so it's like a ways off now. But it's almost the same expression on their face and everything, the sort of like blank look as they're about to do it. Anyway.
That's great.
Yeah.
Okay, well, let's now tuck into the film. There's a lot to unpack here, but before we get into it, we always like to ask our guest to sum up the movie in a sentence. So, Matthew, how would you sum this movie up in a sentence? Be it the movie in general or like a plot synopsis. You can interpret that however you want, but what's your one-sentence summary?
I mean, this is cheating, but I feel like the Twilight Zone is such a cultural institution that I can just say It's the Twilight Zone. Like, it's
fair enough.
It's an anthology of 4 Twilight Zone shorts made by, at the time, quite famous, quite artistically well respected directors, including John Landis, Stephen Spielberg, George Miller, and Joe Dante.
Yeah.
And starring just a who's who of like late 70s, early 80s character talent.
Totally. Well, you already sort of alluded to the fact that you grew up watching The Twilight Zone. Would you say that this is one of your favorite series, or was it just something that you like watched as a kid and therefore knew really well? Like, what is your actual relationship with the show?
I don't know if you're familiar with growing up rural in the 80s, but like you only have a few TV channels, and one of them exclusively shows like daytime TV and reruns.
Right.
And The Twilight Zone was one of the things that was always on repeats. So I had watched a ton of it, like all the way up into my teens when we finally got a satellite dish. And by satellite dish, I don't mean like direct TV, like satellite dish. I mean, we had a 10-foot like satellite dish.
Yeah, the big, I remember those. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And we finally got HBO, and that's when I became like a huge movie nerd. I have seen the Twilight Zone movie before. Ironically, once we got that satellite dish, it was one of those things that was just sort of on network TV all the time.
Right.
So I don't know if I have ever sat down and watched it front to back more than once before, but I've definitely seen like all of the segments multiple times before.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Just by catching them on TV, because you don't used to be able to pause and record TV for the youngs out there. It definitely didn't get its hooks in me like Star Trek did, because I don't know if you're aware of this, but I'm a huge Star Trek dork. But it's definitely one of those things where like I appreciate all of it, even the ones I don't really like. I'm like, that is a seminal piece of writing. Like Rod Serling is one of the most influential writers of the century. Yeah, because of the show, and then the follow-up. And then one thing we had when I was a kid too, we didn't have a Twilight Zone series, but we did have a revival of The Outer Limits, and I just sort of love that anthology format specifically for these kinds of stories. These sort of like horror and morality tales, I think, are really well suited to the anthology format.
Why do you think that is, Matthew? Because I was also thinking that watching this movie. I mean, and this movie's maybe not the best version of it, but like I was thinking back about all the shows that I watched as a kid that had that format. What is it about short stories or short films that kind of work so well for horror or thought-provoking sci-fi pieces?
I think it's that, and especially in the case of the original Twilight Zone with only like 20 to 25 minute episodes, I think it serves them well to be stripped basically entirely bare. Like many Twilight Zone episodes are very, very high concept, but they also only include the necessary elements. There's not a lot of flourish. There's not a lot of extra padding. Like the one we were just talking about, It's a Good Life, which is in the Simpsons episode, like the whole concept and the whole episode is just a 6-year-old has psychokinetic powers, and that would be terrible. That's the whole show, right? Like, and it doesn't have a lot more than that. And the whole setup is like, the rest of the world doesn't exist. And well, why? Because a 6-year-old has psychokinetic powers. Like that is the setup and the answer for every question in this episode. So it can really hammer home whatever message it's trying to impart.
Totally.
Right. Totally. Well, I was thinking, to your point about that short in particular, I rewatched the episode and it doesn't really have an ending.
No.
Right?
It's actually one of the reasons why it's not one of my favorites, is that it doesn't really have it. Even the closing narration for that episode is even like, no comment here, just a child who's terrible with terrible power.
Exactly. Exactly. But it's like, it can kind of get away with it, I think, because it's short, or just even also having like unhappy endings, right? Which is what the Twilight Zone is famous for in a lot of ways, is these sort of like endings with existential dread. I think the longer the story is, the tougher it is to swallow an ending like that, because you get attached to the characters and all that. And
I've always felt that horror tends to have an ending problem. I can't stand horror movies that are longer than 90 minutes. Shorter is always better. Tighter is always better. And the number of modern horror movies I've watched where I'm like, Act 1's great, Act 2's great, Act 3, everything falls apart. Yeah. It's like, for whatever reason, it feels like it's really hard to do that sort of 3-act structure sometimes. So in a weird way, I feel like maybe when you have such a condensed timeline, you can kind of just make it work. Or if the ending's weaker, maybe you don't notice it as much, because I don't know what it is, but certainly it does seem to work better in that sort of bite-sized format. And certainly there's plenty of examples to talk about. Nate, I wanted to ask you, like, what's your relationship with the Twilight Zone? Because, like, watching this, I was like, man, this feels like something that's, like, right up Nate's alley. Like, this feels like something that you should have been obsessed with in high school.
Yeah, I mean, I think the thing is that, like, through the sheer coincidence of being born a little younger than you, Matthew, I missed it, I think, is kind of the bottom line, is that, like, it wasn't really on TV when I was growing up, but I watched a million other like horror anthology series, some that were for kids and some that were not. So it's like the things I remember from sort of the early 90s, of course, are like you had Goosebumps, which I never really liked very much. I found it kind of corny and not very scary. Are You Afraid of the Dark, which actually does feel more like Twilight Zone for kids. Because it had episodes that had that kind of like existential dread sort of stuff, and like that were kind of thought experiments of the sort of what if aspect of the Twilight Zone.
And the awesome framing device too, which is what I loved about
Campfire
that show.
Story.
Yeah.
Even I think maybe the thing that they say when they throw the dust into the fire,
submitted for the approval of the Midnight Society.
That's from the Twilight Zone. Right?
Yeah, totally.
Submitted for your approval, that whole thing. And then Freaky Stories is the other one that comes to mind, which was, so I didn't realize this, that's a Canadian specific thing. And like, it was not so much available in the US. But, you know, for those who don't know, the framing device was puppets, and then the stories were cartoons. But it was still this sort of like, mostly like urban legends, I guess is how I would describe it, in terms of where the source for the stories comes from in that one.
Nate, did you know that my mom worked on that show?
Oh, no way. That's crazy.
Yeah.
I mean, I knew your mom worked on those types of shows, but
yeah. I went to the set of Freaky Stories like multiple times.
Wow.
So I got to meet the puppets.
You got to meet Maurice the Maggot?
Yeah, it was gross. They showed me the bucket of goo. I specifically remember the prop guy telling me, he's like, yeah, this is the same recipe that they used on Ghostbusters. And I was like, oh, that's cool. That's a show I actually really like.
Right.
I wasn't particularly fond of Freaky Stories.
No. Of all of those, Are You Afraid of the Dark was by far the superior show, I think.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, that was all floating around in the early 90s. Like, this format seems like it was super popular at that point.
There was also, weirdly, the, like, I think we talked about it when we talked about Nightmare on Elm Street, but there was the Nightmare on Elm Street and the Friday the 13th anthology series, which was the same idea. I think Friday the 13th, they were just, like, again, scary stories, and then the Nightmare on Elm Street ones were completely unrelated to Nightmare on Elm Street, except for the fact that they had wraparounds hosted by Freddy Krueger. I think I never watched
a good
them,
horror host. Actually, very similar to Crypt Keeper,
Tales from the Crypt. Yeah, another horror anthology show. Yeah,
right. But The Outer Limits was the sort of adult one that I watched because it was, I think, in its sort of reboot run when I was a kid.
Right.
And so we watched that as a family along with Star Trek: The Next Generation. My parents were kind of into that kind of heady sci-fi stuff.
Interesting.
The reboot Outer Limits ran from like the mid 90s to the late 90s, I think.
Right. Yeah, that sounds right.
That's the kind of thing that I would like, you know, sneak away and watch by myself while my parents were watching some more family friendly thing. That and the X-Files, basically.
Oh yeah, totally.
1995. Gee, taking me back.
Adam, what about you?
Like you, Nate, I watched Goosebumps and Are You Afraid of the Dark and was aware of Freaky Stories, didn't really like it, despite the fact that, like, I knew everybody who made it. I guess it wasn't really my thing. Like, I kind of came to horror stuff later in life. I think Scream was sort of my gateway drug. I mean, I liked Hitchcock and stuff, and actually Alfred Hitchcock Presents, which is another sort of anthology series. Like, I did watch that because I was obsessed with Alfred Hitchcock. Same. But I don't think I ever really liked any of the stuff that, like, I was watching it because it was Alfred Hitchcock, but I was also like, these don't feel like Alfred Hitchcock stories. And I think the ones I was watching was like they would have the wraparounds with Hitchcock, but then it was like shot in like 1993 because they rebooted the series, so they weren't very good.
I don't know if you're like me though, because the theme music to that show is permanently etched into my brain.
Oh yeah,
absolutely.
Yeah, no, it's so good. Yeah. Funeral March for a Marionette.
The Simpsons,
yes,
one
exactly.
of the Treehouse of Horrors.
Yeah. When I was watching this, the thing that I kept thinking about, Nate, was Eternal Darkness.
May the rats eat your eyes! I am now lost to your cause! The darkness comes! It will damn us all!
The weird Lovecraftian horror video game that we played in high school, because like that is sort of a horror anthology video game in a weird way.
Yeah,
and
one of the best things on the GameCube.
Yes. Oh, without a doubt. I just love that sort of framing device. But no, I was never into the Twilight Zone. But it's this funny thing in that I think, as you sort of said, Matthew, like the cultural legs of Twilight Zone go beyond. It's a show I never watched, but everybody knows the Twilight Zone theme. It's this weird thing of like, I know my family does it, and like I'm sure other families do when they like say something spooky and then they want to kind of like drive the message home. They always would go like, doo 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 doo.
Yeah.
Like it's just like the theme song has permeated culture to just mean like something creepy. That was probably like my closest relationship to it, was just like knowing it existed and knowing the theme, but not really watching it until like university, when I believe in one of my classes we watched the segment that's based on Picnic at Hanging Rock. And I don't even remember why we watched it. I don't remember the context for what it was, but just this idea of like this whole story is being told and then you discover that it's his flashback seconds before he dies. And I remember thinking, oh, this is really cool. Like I should maybe get into this. And then I never really did. But, and that
what
brought
about,
us.
what about the movie?
The movie, I hate to say it, the only reason I knew about the movie was because I knew about what happened on the movie.
Yeah.
And
That's
knowing about what happened on the movie, had absolutely no desire to watch it.
Yep.
Until, we had to watch it for this show. And needless to say, and I'm sure we're going to get into this, it definitely colored my viewing experience.
Yeah. I think it's unavoidable in some ways.
Yeah, it's interesting to me because I had sort of the opposite experience, that I saw it a bunch of times. Again, like I said, on TV and such.
Yeah.
I had no idea about the accident until I was an adult. So like in the early zeros, when I finally like found out about this, and I basically hadn't watched the movie since then.
Yeah.
Like I knew it existed. I'd seen clips online and such like you do, but like I had not watched the movie in full or in part since like 2004.
Right.
It's because it's shocking. It's legitimately shocking.
Yeah. Yeah.
And honestly, knowing what happened also made it very difficult to revisit a lot of John Landis films as well.
Yeah.
It's a real thing.
I was surprised to hear you say that it had been airing on reruns on TV, but for that reason, because like they questioned whether they should even release it, right?
But at the same time, like it makes sense that they would run it on TV because it would be so easy to like chunk it up into a commercial.
For sure.
You know what I mean? Like it's 100% a move based on the fact that it easily fits into a 2-hour time slot, or like a 2.5-hour time slot with commercials.
Well, and then I'm proof positive that like not everyone knows or is going to care.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Like,
and to your point, Matthew, of when it was airing, this would have been pre or like early days of the internet. So
Right.
yeah, this have been like
finding
early 90s, mid 90s.
Yeah, I feel like that would have been that era of like, unless you knew or like remember the tragedy from when it came out, it could easily sort of get lost and forgotten about until it becomes a thing that, they post on Reddit every couple years of like, did you know? And then you're like, ugh.
Even considering that the court cases didn't end until I think like 86 or 87. Like I think it was 4 or 5 years later that the court cases dragged on to that. Like mid 90s is still just enough time to forget, or for that to fade from like overall cultural memory. It's a difficult thing to talk about. I'm interested to get into it, but it's a difficult thing to talk about.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And on that note, that very difficult, awkward note, let's do the plot synopsis of the movie, or as best as we can. So we always like to pull our plot synopses from, unique locations. And so I actually pulled this from the Laserdisc release of Twilight Zone, the movie.
Okay.
And we have individual synopses for each segment, but we'll get to those. So I sort of just took the framing device of the synopsis in a weird way. And here's what the Laserdisc release of the Twilight Zone, how it describes the film. Rod Serling's legendary Twilight Zone taught a whole generation of TV viewers to explore the boundaries between fantasy and reality. Now, Twilight Zone the movie takes you even deeper into this strange and fearful dimension of the mind, in the company of 4 film directors with powerful visions of their own. Each episode has its own distinct style and flavor. Each tells you a little bit more about the tricks your mind can play and the secret wonders or terrors that lie just beneath the surface of our own comfortable, everyday existence. Twilight Zone the movie will delight you with humor, move you with beauty, yet always keep you on the razor's edge of tension. Like 1982's hit Creepshow, this is state-of-the-art in cinema horror. But like the classic Dead of the Night, it's also a little bit more. And more is what you'll beg for. Nope, that is
claim.
absolutely not what I was doing at the end of this. But yeah, bold claim, Laserdisc. Bold claim.
That's some brilliant marketing copy, though. Like, damn.
Yeah. Well, before we get into sort of our deconstruction of the film, we always sort of like to get a little bit into the background and sort of how it came to be. Obviously, we've touched on the fact that this was originally based on Twilight Zone, the TV show, a show created by the legendary Rod Serling that ran from 1959 until 1964 and used science fiction and horror to examine real-world taboo issues. And then it was revived like multiple times up until his passing.
No. After
his passing. Yeah, excuse me. Yeah. So there was the 1985 reboot, which lasted until 1989. There was a reboot in 2002, 2003. And then most recently, the Jordan Peele reboot in 2019, 2020. I remember when the Jordan Peele one came out and being like, oh, I should watch that. That's probably going to be really cool. And then I just never got around to it. Because I think it was on like a weird streaming service. And I was just like, I can't be bothered.
Yeah, it was on... I want to say
like CBS All Access or something.
Yeah, it was on. I think what's now Paramount Plus.
Yeah, right. That sounds
I had to watch it. I'm sure you guys are in Canada too, so I watched it on City TV, the City TV app.
Oh, okay.
Where it still is, for the record, if you want to watch it.
It's one of those weird CBS things where it's like, even though it was direct to streaming down there, up here, one of our channels bought it, so like you couldn't actually stream it on the direct to streaming thing. It's very annoying.
I mean, and like to your point, I was excited about it when I heard about it, and then I didn't end up watching it. But it's like Jordan Peele does seem like kind of one of the heir apparents to the style of sci-fi horror in my mind. Of like, it's a little heady, but it's still entertaining, and he manages to make like feature-length movies that I think frequently stick the landing in terms of like what the premise is.
I will say that having seen the Jordan Peele one, so I haven't seen all of the 85 to 89 one. The only one I really remember is that very famously there is a sequel to A Good Life in the 1985 series with Bill Mummy, with the same kid.
Oh, cool.
But as an adult. And then I've seen one or two of the early 2000s one, but I have seen all of the Jordan Peele one. And it's the same thing with any anthology show. Again, a format that I really like, but some of them are bangers and some of them are fine. Some of them are fine.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah, totally. Kind of just depends on the writer and director you get that week, I guess.
Yeah, but I will say that Jordan Peele is, of all the people who've also done it, he is by far the best at the like opening, closing narration, other than Rod Serling.
I could see that.
Yeah.
Nate, I feel like we also should talk a little bit about this sort of idea of anthology horror. And I know you did a little bit of research into that because that, is sort of where this is all coming out of. So what did you sort of uncover?
Well, I think the other thing, too, is just that it's obviously also where Treehouse of Horror is coming from, too.
Right. Yeah, totally.
And so the big thing that I realized looking into this, because it's not something I'm super familiar with, was just there's a long history of this, both in terms of like short stories, so actually like written content, and comics, of course, EC Comics being the sort of primary inspiration for Treehouse of Horror. And even in film, this is crazy to me, the first one of these was Eerie Tales in 1919.
Oh, wow. That
so
early.
It's like, it basically goes back to the origin of cinema, right?
Wow.
Doing these types of things, even including like the wraparound. The idea of having like a story within the story, a group of people telling stories to each other, like that goes back that far.
That's cool.
So I thought that was interesting. Other important ones that kind of came up over the years, Dead of Night, right? Mentioned in the copy for the laser disc of this movie, right? That came out in 1945. It's British. There's actually a lot of British productions of this type, which, I don't know, kind of makes sense to me in a way. It's almost the BBC sort of sensibility of like miniseries and that kind of thing. But probably the most interesting thing about that one is it includes a story about a living ventriloquist dummy, which is something that has been redone a million times on The Twilight Zone, Goosebumps, Chucky, right? And The Simpsons, of course.
Yep. Gabbo.
So
I guess Gabbo's not a living ventriloquist dummy. It's the crusty doll that comes to life.
Or is
he?
Or is he? Yeah.
But and you also have the Krusty doll too, right?
Yeah.
Another one that's worth noting is Tales of Terror from 1962, which is the first collaboration between Roger Corman, mentor to many filmmakers, including Joe Dante, and Vincent Price. And they did a long series of collaborations that were adaptations of Edgar Allan Poe stories.
Have you guys not seen those? Because they are.
I've seen one of them.
They are great. They were all on Criterion Channel last year, so I watched all of them.
Oh, nice.
And they are
Nice.
so good. Like, in a very, like, 1960s kind of way. You know how, like, everyone has a Vincent Price imitation? Like, they are very like that, you know? Like,
Yes.
Right.
they are
Yeah,
exactly,
yeah.
when you say, like, Vincent Price is the protagonist of this story, you can be like, oh, okay, I sort of know what I'm in for now.
Yeah,
that's what all
Totally.
of these are exactly like.
100%. Yeah, I saw the Fall of the House of Usher, right? Which I think is might be the first one. It was great. I really, really enjoyed it. And for some reason, I don't think people talk about it that much, but these are definitely worth watching. Adam, you would love it. It's right up your alley, I think.
Yeah, that sounds so good, especially with Vincent Price.
Yeah,
that guy
exactly.
rules. I'll watch him in anything.
Yeah, and there's like 6 or 7 of them, I think. There's a bunch of them.
Wow. Okay.
There's 6 of them, yeah. The only
There
one
you
that's
go.
not great is the very last one, and that's because he's like 50 years old and he's playing a character who's like 24, and you're just like,
Oh,
usually I can get past that kind of thing and be like, it's a show, but then like, no, he's like a very old man, and the love interest is like 19, and it's just not
Right.
the thing, you know? Like,
yeah, absolutely.
Very cool.
So late 60s and 70s, you have a whole series by Amicus Productions, another British company. They sort of keep the horror anthology thing alive for a while. And they were really inspired by Dead of Night. So, you know, there's kind of this lineage there. One of the movies they do is Tales from the Crypt, which is an adaptation, of course, of the EC Comics at that point. This is like the first film adaptation of the EC Comics thing.
Interesting.
And that was in
Okay.
1972.
Cool. I'm just looking at the poster for it right now, and that is a cool-ass poster.
Creepshow, 1982, again mentioned on the back copy. This one is a George A. Romero joint and a collaboration with Stephen King and Tom Savini. I think just those names kind of can paint a pretty good picture of what this kind of is.
Have you seen it, Nate?
I haven't, but it doesn't actually sound up my alley. It's kind
It's
of
not-
the other direction of this
Yeah.
that is not really my thing as much.
it's a bit grim.
I wanted to like it, and there are like some cool moments in it, but on the whole, yeah, it's just not. It wasn't really my jam.
Yeah. But also inspired by EC Comics.
yeah, very heavily inspired, like right down to having like comic type visuals incorporated into it in a way that I've never really seen anything else ever do since then.
Right.
Which is kind of neat, but.
So, like, the thing that I after reading up on this that I was thinking about the most was just that I feel like Treehouse of Horror is kind of taking from 2 lineages where you have this type of horror anthology that's really like adapting a lot of short stories, really coming out of the genre world, but then it's also really influenced by Twilight Zone. And like the difference with Twilight Zone is that I don't think Rod Serling really comes out of the genre world so much. His background before this is more like straight dramas, and he like loved pulp as a kid. But the reason he was attracted to it, or so, you know, these sources say, is that he saw genre as a way to talk about things that straight dramas wouldn't allow him to talk about it.
Right.
And so he's kind of coming at it in this different way, right?
I know that EC Comics is where they got the name for in The Simpsons for doing like scary names in the title cards. Like,
Right,
like
yeah,
for
yeah.
the people, for all the people involved. They
Yep.
got that directly from EC Comics.
Totally. Yeah, I feel like it's kind of this mashup of those 2 things, but like the Twilight Zone is, I think, as important a strain in the way they think about them as EC Comics, because there's like classic tales like the Monkey's Paw that again have happened in many of these anthologies. Then there's like direct Twilight Zone adaptations, and then there's kind of like film parodies that creep their way in over time. But that heady, ironic, twisted sort of aspect that I feel like Twilight Zone brings is always an important element.
I mean,
Well, that-
the Monkey's Paw one is also like, there's so many Twilight episodes that can be boiled down to just be careful what you wish for.
Totally.
Like, whether or not there's a monkey's paw, that's the theme of the show.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, back to the movie now. So I have to say it's surprisingly hard to find details about the making of this. Most of the details that are written and that you can find are obviously in relation to the horrible tragedy that happened during the making of. But it seems like this was the brainchild of Spielberg and John Landis. They loved the Twilight Zone growing up, and they were like, we could turn this into a movie. We could do it, pretty low budget. And the studio was on board because they were like, well, we're going to get another Spielberg movie. And you have to remember, this is like 1983 or whatever. So
Yeah.
Spielberg is like as hot as can be. But they also love the idea of like, if this takes off, we can just do this every year. Like, this is being made for like $10 million. You know, we get whatever the hot directors are of the moment, give them, you know, a couple $1 million each to remake a Twilight Zone episode, package them together. We've got a series now. So it all kind of makes sense from a financial standpoint as to why everybody's sort of game to do this. Apparently, there were only 3 segments originally. It was going to be Spielberg, Joe Dante, and John Landis. And then for whatever reason, they brought George Miller on early in production, but like someone made the decision, why don't we do 4?
It's because Mad Max 2 was such a huge hit.
Okay, that which makes a lot of sense. Yeah,
like it was like the year before the Road Warrior came out, and they're like, we should get that guy. Pretty much. Yeah. And it shows because his segment is one of the better ones.
Absolutely.
Agreed.
And then, of course, the film is perhaps best remembered because of this horrible tragedy that happens during the making of John Landis's segment that resulted in the death of the actor Vic Morrow and 2 child actors that had been illegally hired by the production. There's plenty that's been said about this. Like, I don't think we need to go too deep into it because when you read about it, like it really is pretty horrifying to read, and like I don't want to dwell on it, but it is important to understand in the context of the film because basically this was very, very early in production that this happened, and from what I can tell, this accident that results in the death of 3 actors basically changes the tone of everybody who is involved. Like Spielberg's heart was allegedly from that point on, he just wasn't really interested in, and I think they were all kind of shocked that the thing kind of proceeded. Dante says he's like, they really should have just shut down production and like tossed everything out. But again, the studio was like, well, we really want this Spielberg thing. So they proceeded. I
think this is probably before the age of being able to write things off the way that some studios are able to now as well.
Well, and realistically, again, we sort of touched on this. This is pre-internet. Like so you don't have Deadline and TMZ and all these industry reports talking about it, and then all these people on Twitter talking about it, and the bad press. Obviously, it was in the press and like it was known, but as you sort of said, like the cycles meant that by the time the movie comes out, it might just be sort of a forgotten memory, or they could pitch it in a way of, it's actually in the synopsis for the first segment that's on the Laserdisc, you know, they refer to him as the late Vic Morrow. They don't really explain why he's the late Vic Morrow, but like...
How deep do you want to get into this? Because I actually did a bit of research and I watched the Cursed Films episode again.
I also watched the Cursed Films episode and saw the footage and was like, well, that's... didn't need to see that.
The footage, I'm because they had 5 cameras going apparently, and they showed the one from like the furthest away, and it's still just harrowing. And like it's one of those things where like it looks like nothing, but because you know what's happening, you're like, I just watched 3 people die. Like, how do you process that? Yeah, and like you can't imagine what it must have been like for all the people on set, including both of those kids' parents who were watching.
Oh,
yeah. I don't want to get too deep into it because like you could make an entire episode about that, and I do want to touch on the other stuff. But if you want to find out more about what actually happened, there is a episode of Cursed Films dedicated to it that I think does do a fairly decent job of like contextualizing everything, explaining what happened, unfortunately showing what happened. But again, like even if you pull up the Wikipedia page for this film, it's like, you know, the plot synopsis is maybe 1/8 of the page. Most of the page is just dedicated to the accident and the fallout from it.
And the accident also has its own Wikipedia page.
Yes, exactly.
So it's like that far overshadowed, I think, any other context that you can find about this. So it's out there.
That kind of leads to how we want to frame this whole conversation, I think. And what we were thinking, Matthew, is maybe you could rank the segments and then we'll sort of talk about them as we rank them. There's technically 4 segments and then a prologue/epilogue. So those are sort of the bonuses, I guess. What would you say is the best segment that we get?
So the best segment, I think, is the Nightmare at 20,000 Feet remake.
Okay, interesting.
Starring John Lithgow and directed by George Miller, and famously edited by Joe Dante because George Miller walked on production after the accident. His was already in post, and he was just like, I'm out. I'm not doing this anymore. I really like the original series episode, and I think it's an improvement on that, simply by taking the entire concept and dialing every little thing in it to 11.
Yeah, they really do dial it up.
Right? Like, they're not just in turbulence, they're in a storm. And, like, he's not just, like, a little bit upset. He's, like, having a full-blown anxiety attack from the very beginning. And
Yeah.
all of the camera movements are big, and the monster design is like 1,000 times scarier.
so much better.
so much better. I mean, movie budgets versus 60s TV budget, to be fair, but also like it's just so much better. And like
they show a lot in the TV show, and it's such a bad costume that it's like they probably would have been better to leave it a little bit shadowy or whatever.
I mean, he's basically just wearing a shag carpet. It's ridiculous,
right?
It's. But like everything about it is better. I think that George Miller really knows how to move a camera in really interesting ways. Like you could watch this segment and be like, yeah, that's a George Miller movie.
Yeah. There's like a couple moments, like when he finally gets out on the wing and he's shooting at the monster.
Yeah.
There's even that like classic speed ramping thing that he does in all of his movies. You can go watch Fury Road right now and see the exact same move.
The visuals in this are so good. Not only the creature effects, but some of the like special effects. Like there's this great moment where Lithgow opens up the window and the creature's right at the window, and like so you get this jump scare on the creature, but then you get this crazy, and it's only for like a couple frames, but a shot of Lithgow and his eyes are like bulging out, and then like
so
which
good.
is just so crazy. And again, like the frenetic editing, but it's so impactful. I wouldn't necessarily say it's the best looking one. And we'll talk about that, but it has a very, very unique visual style that I absolutely loved.
And then I also like that at the end, like in the original one, he's carted away and everyone's like, I guess he's just crazy. And it sort of does a slow pan to, maybe there's some damage. And in this one, it's very clear that like there was a monster. Like he was right the whole time.
Yeah.
And I prefer that.
Oh, yeah. I agree. I think that ending is actually also reflected in The Simpsons parody of it as well, where it's like everyone's looking at the buses really destroyed, and like even the slashes and stuff like that. And the monster design, I think, is all actually from the movie and not from the original episode.
Well, yeah, I mean, I watched the commentary for that specific episode, and Silverman says that it is a little bit of a combination of both, but also very much inspired by like The Grinch.
It looks like
kinda,
the Grinch.
Yeah, it kind of has like
so
a Dr.
sense.
Seuss. Yeah, he wanted to make it a little more friendly, so he's like, yeah, I kind of gave it a bit of that like Dr. Seuss Grinch vibe. But he also says specifically that like Bart's reactions throughout the sequence are very much supposed to be like a splitting of the difference between Shatner and Lithgow.
Oh, interesting. I think one of the ones that I really recognized was I think at some point, Bart sort of hits his head with both of his fists. That's a Shatnerism, I think, from the original.
Okay.
It is, yeah. It's a very Shatner thing, because in the original, he's taking his flight after having had a nervous breakdown on a plane like 6 months ago, whereas in the movie, John Lithgow just doesn't want to be on the plane. Like, he's just afraid of flying. So it's a little more impactful that
which
way,
I have
too.
to say, I sympathize with, because I hate going on an airplane and was just on an airplane last week. Oh, I hate it. I'm always like, just get this over with as quickly as possible. I definitely understand where Lithgow is coming from. I mean, I've never seen a gremlin on the airplane, but
not yet, anyway.
Yeah,
not yet. I always look.
Yeah.
Yeah, but I was going to say, I think the lead up to the original episode is better. I think him having had a nervous breakdown 6 months ago in the original is more interesting, because when he's like, there's a gremlin, they're all like, he's just going at it again. In the movie, he's just having a nervous breakdown from the beginning, and they're like, this guy's crazy. And I think that the former's a little better, but the ending of the movie one is better. So it sort of splits the difference there.
I think the act one of the episodes is consistently better than the movie for all of these, pretty much.
Interesting.
The setup is better in the show than in the movies. And I wonder if it's because they're trying to kind of trim the fat, but like they've actually cut too deep, and they've cut out some of the important setup of these characters. Because it's like, I agree definitely in this segment that I love the sort of buildup of Shatner's character and the almost like Boy Who Cried Wolf aspect of it. Of like people already not trusting him. Whereas in this, you kind of get that, but Lithgow is just kind of like losing his mind from literally moment one of this segment.
Yeah.
I mean, I will ask you both, because I unfortunately didn't have time to watch the original segment, but since you both are familiar with it, what's your read on Lithgow versus Shatner? Because like for me, Lithgow has a certain place in my mind because of what I know him from, which is essentially I know him from Third Rock from the Sun and then Dexter. And so I always think of him more as a comedic performance, and that Dexter performance, which I think he's so good in that show. but I always think of that as an outlier, and then I always have to remind myself that no, like he actually was a very serious actor for a period and also played a ton of villains, and like that was more his lane, and like Third Rock was kind of him stepping out of his comfort zone in a Leslie Nielsen-esque way.
I was going to say, if those are the things you know him from, there's absolutely nothing wrong with that, but you need to add Cliffhanger to your watch list to watch an iconic Lithgow villain performance.
Oh,
Interesting.
all right.
I mean, the other thing I'm familiar with him as is playing the Hal Prince type character in All That Jazz, which he's in that movie for all of like. You don't remember this name?
I forgot that he's in that.
Yeah, he's in it for like
movie.
5 or 6 minutes, and he's like a baby. He's probably like 23 or something. But yeah, he's supposed to be Hal Prince, which I think is cool.
He's also the dad in Harry and the Hendersons. If you're of an age, that'll be a film.
That's true. But so, yeah, my question still stands. Like, what is your read on Lithgow's performance? As you said, Matthew, like everything in this is dialed up to 11. He's certainly performing at an 11.
I mean, I think I love it because it's so big. There's no other word for it. It is a big performance. It is like every gesture is huge and every like twitch of the eye is huge. He's constantly in a flop sweat. He's got like huge dark circles. And like, if you notice too, like whenever it's him, the camera is like very frantic and moving around and causing weird shifts in the focus. And it's very stable on everyone else. So it really like lends a lot to his performance. That being said, I don't really want to pick between them because they're so different.
That's valid.
That's where I land. Yeah,
because Cheddar's another guy who's known for being like
subtle,
having a certain cadence, shall we say?
Right.
Yes.
And he doesn't really have that in this. And I've watched William Shatner in a lot of stuff, and like not just Star Trek, but like Boston Legal and lots of movies and like all kinds of stuff. And this is one of his more subdued earlier performances. It's a lot more subtle and it's still pretty big, but it's like a 7, not an 11, you know?
It's perfect for the tone of that episode, I think.
It's cool. Pitch perfect for the story they're trying to tell.
It is interesting that it's before Trek, because I kind of wonder if his performance as Kirk sort of became the way he acted always, because it sort of like started bleeding into just his persona as an actor. Because before this, it's like this episode is completely different. Like he's not at all like that. What you think of when you think of Shatner, and it is a really good performance. Same with
his. It's actually his second time on the Twilight Zone too, and his other performance is just like that too. He's really good in that episode as well. Not that he's bad in Star Trek. It's just feels different.
No, but everybody knows
he's doing his thing, right? Like that's more what it is. It's just that like he starts to have a very specific lane, and that's kind of what you get him for. But seems like he's pretty diverse before that.
Yeah.
Nate, would this also be your number one segment then?
I'm not sure. I really like It's a Good Life as well. I think it would be between those two.
Okay. If it's your number two.
No, let's go to the worst next. So we don't end on a bummer. Let's go to the worst.
Fair enough. What's the worst segment?
Are we including the prologue? Because I hate the prologue.
Oh, really? See, that's interesting because I loved the prologue.
Let's include it as a segment. Let's do it. So, prologue.
So I will say that the prologue and all the John Landis stuff, not just because of what happened, but I don't like any of the John Landis stuff in this movie. I think it's all bad. And I'll say that I think the prologue is worse because I think it's kind of pointless. It just exists to give you a jump scare, and I don't think it's a very good jump scare, for one. And although I do love Dan Aykroyd and Albert Brooks both, and I think they're very good in it, I don't like it at all. It's cheap. It just feels cheap.
I loved it, and I'm going to now defend it. I think what you're saying is 100% true, Matthew, and it totally doesn't fit within the theme of what the show or the film actually ends up being. So it feels very out of place.
It does, yeah.
But I do really like it because I will say it's the one part of the movie where I actually was feeling tension. So I sort of gone through the Wikipedia article before I watched the film just so I could sort of understand everything. So I knew what was going to happen at the end of the segment. I knew that this jump scare was coming. So like the scare itself, like it didn't really scare me, but I kept waiting and waiting for it to happen. And I noticed this sort of like my stomach was starting to sink and like this sense of dread was coming because I was like, when's it going to happen? When's it going to happen? And because too, like I think Brooks and Aykroyd are just so goddamn likable and so funny. It's sort of subverting your expectations. And, you know, when he keeps being like, no, do you want to see something really scary?
Yeah.
And you think he's going to do something silly, but like, I know that it's not going to be something silly. So like, it's that classic, like, show the audience the bomb under the seat. So I like the sort of use of comedy and horror. We've talked a ton on this show about how I think that those two things always go best hand in hand. And it's funny, it reminded me of the sort of meta nature of the Scream series, which is my favorite horror series. Sure. And specifically, Nate, do you remember at the beginning of Scream 4, they basically do this same thing. They do a fake out teaser where it's like two, at the time, relatively famous actresses, and then at the end, Kristen Bell stabs the girl.
Right.
Spoiler alert. Yes. And you're sort of like, whoa, what? Like, and so I like that sort of idea of like, I don't really know where this is going. But having said that, totally on board with your point, Matthew, that like it serves no real purpose because the rest of the movie isn't like this at all. Right. So
I wouldn't even say it's poorly executed. I would just say that I doesn't do anything for me at all.
Yeah. Yeah, I think I would have rather actually had maybe even like a host segment.
I much rather would have had, instead of just having Burgess Meredith be the omniscient voice, I would have much rather have had him walk on screen and be like, submitted for your consideration.
Right,
you know, like,
exactly. And maybe you could even have a little fake out with that where it's like he's, I don't know, talking to an audience, it turns out, and then it's something else, like whatever, but like something that kind of plays on the host segment of the show, I think would have been more appropriate. But that said, I did really enjoy the back and forth between Aykroyd and Brooks in the car and all of the stuff of like the headlights being turned off and the singing the theme songs. I liked all that part. I didn't love the meta part of them talking about the Twilight Zone.
Yeah,
because it didn't feel like
unnecessary.
It didn't feel like it had anything to say, right? Like that's the thing about the Scream thing that you're talking about is that movie's all about that, right?
Yeah.
100%. Whereas talking about the Twilight Zone in this movie is literally just trying to get people to be like, oh yeah, I do love the Twilight Zone. And I don't think that really worked for me. And the jump scare sucks. And it's not really what the show is about.
It definitely feels Landis-y, and it reminds me of probably my favorite John Landis movie outside of like the Thriller music video, which I guess doesn't really count. But like I love American Werewolf in London.
Right.
And this definitely has that vibe. Again, that sort of like striking the balance between comedy and horror. But again, I think you're both right in that tonally, which is maybe my big problem with the movie as a whole, is that tonally this thing is all over the place. But this especially feels kind of broken and weird. So outside of the prologue, let's now say that the prologue doesn't count, Matthew. What would you say is the worst proper segment?
Oh, the John Landis directed Vic Morrow starring one.
Just roll right into the next segment.
And honestly, again, like, first of all, yes, it's super hard to watch. It's and it comes first, so it is a difficult thing to like get through when watching the movie. But I just don't think it's very good. I think that the setup is bad. I think that in the original, and this isn't a remake of one, it's sort of a remix of two different Twilight Zone episodes. Yeah. And in both cases, the protagonists learn something, and in this one, he does not. There's a point to everything that happens to them in the episodes, and in this one, he's just carted away in a cattle car at the end. It doesn't learn anything. He kind of does, but like not in a way that's like tangible or means anything.
And part of that is due to the fact that so they cut out the stuff that resulted in the accident, which was supposed to be this idea of like he's in Vietnam. I don't really understand the context for all this, but like the idea is that he then sees these two Vietnamese children and he's trying to rescue them from the Viet Cong or whatever. So I guess that's supposed to be his like moment of redemption, but then it's cut out of the segment for obvious reasons and like is one of the better choices that Landis made. But
maybe the only good choice.
Yes, maybe. But then, like you said, Matthew, like you don't get any actual like denouement or like he doesn't evolve really.
So I was reading about this though, and they did cut that out, but he insists that it would not have changed the ending.
Yeah, apparently the segment that they were filming when the accident happened was like a studio note. Like, you got to give this guy some redemption.
Right.
And so they were filming this to give him that. And so for better or for worse, the segment we have is sort of what Landis originally intended.
Well, to your point, Nate, my understanding is that basically he would end up back in Nazi-occupied Paris with the kids, and the kids are carted away separately. So it was like, it doesn't change the ending in that, like...
Yeah.
the ending as it plays out still plays out that way, but
Right.
it's you at
He
least
like
get
learns
that
something, but then is
you
presumably
get that
killed
character
anyway.
exactly.
Yeah.
You get that sort of character arc, but
And-
it's just
It's a very John Landis segment. You watch it and you're like, yeah, that is definitely a John Landis made thing.
Yeah.
It's full of people who I think are great. Like Charles Halloran is one of the friends at the beginning. Stephen Williams, Mr. X from the X-Files, is in it at the beginning. There's a
Yep.
baby John Larroquette for like 10 seconds in the middle of it.
Yeah, as one of the Klansmen.
Wow.
Yeah,
There's all kinds of people
Doug-
like that.
Canada's own Douglas McGrath is one of the friends at the beginning. Yeah, I was trying to come up with something positive to say. I like the production design. This movie is made for very little money. And in that Cursed Films things, they talk with the production designer and they sort of say like, hey, welcome to the big leagues now. Because his work is really, really good.
Yeah.
But watching this whole segment, I just felt sick to my stomach because
Yeah.
I was just like,
Knowing what went into it.
It's also just that, like, you mentioned earlier that Act 1 is, like, universally not as good. It's the smallest thing. But in one of the Twilight Zone episodes, the one where a man starts out in a club, and they're having a conversation about time travel, and they're like, if you could go back in time, if you could change something, would you? And would it have any effect? And
Right.
he goes outside, and when he goes outside, there's a moment where he, like, stumbles, and he, like, has a headache, and the camera goes fuzzy, and makes it clear that he is going back in time.
Right.
And in this, Vic Morrow just goes outside the door and he's back in time. And like,
Well, actually,
and the conversation was about time travel.
yeah, and
so
like,
it's sort
and-
of setting up the theme of like what's
Exactly.
going to happen a little bit, Yeah.
That brings me to one of my like big sort of question marks that I wrote in my notes watching this segment. I was like, what are the rules of this world and this universe? And
Yeah.
and I guess like that's maybe a silly question to ask. And I as the thing progressed, I understood that, oh, that's what the Twilight Zone is meant to be. It's the fifth dimension. It's like all of these people are being transported through the Twilight Zone. But like I was sort of sitting there going, okay, well, like, is this guy really going through time? Is this like a fantasy? Is this a dream? What's the reality of this story?
so did you
and that was
guys-
never made clear to me.
Did you guys watch the two original segments before?
I watched one of them, the one where it involves the assassination of Abraham Lincoln
Yeah.
and time travel,
Yeah.
all of that.
That's a much better segment than this.
Oh,
I will say,
by
like,
far.
Just from
so
by the
much better.
description, it sounds better. Yeah.
Because again, first off, you know that he's going back in time, and then you realize how he's going back in time, or at least why. And then when he comes back, like there's a moral to what happened. Like again,
Right.
it's a bit of a like be careful what you wish for type situation.
Right.
Yeah.
And in the other one, which has a baby Leonard Nimoy in it, it's about like an army platoon who's about to attack a Japanese position in the Philippines in World War II. And the new commanding officer of the platoon is a baby Dean Stockwell, which is shocking. And like he's about to order his troops into battle, and he switches places with the Japanese commander. And right.
Okay.
And then at the end, he switches back, and there's a whole like, maybe I don't do the bloodthirsty thing, like,
Right.
So again, like he learns something, and I can't get over the fact that he just goes back in time and then he's carted off, and that's the end, and it's just not
Yeah.
very good.
Well, and also, I mean, this is the definition of a hat on a hat, where it's like he could have gone to one place and that would have taught him this thing, and then you'd have time to actually tell a story in that one place.
Yeah.
But instead, he goes to three different places that all have different things going on. In the first one, he's in like Nazi occupied France, and they recognize him as an American, right?
Yeah.
And then someone sort of calls him out as being a Jew, but it's never implied that he has become Jewish. But then in the subsequent ones, he is actually black, and he is actually, Vietnamese. And so it's just like, to your point, Adam, the rules don't really work. They don't really explain them at all. It kind of feels like it changes over time. For such a short thing, it should just be straightforward. Like
It kind of
and it's
feels
not.
like, for better or for worse, it's kind of a John Landis-y thing to sort of try to do too much. And I feel like if they'd chosen one of those things and told that story well, it would be better. Like if you just said the hard R N-word and gone back in time to the lynching, then that would have been maybe better. Or if he'd just talked about the Vietnamese people, or even just maybe because he said he served in Korea, he could have gone back to Korea instead. I don't know.
Right.
I'm not a Hollywood writer. But,
But that would have made sense, because then he would have been a character, and instead he's just like a sort of stock racist.
yeah, exactly. I don't like it. It's not very good. I think Vic Morrow is doing everything he can, although he clearly doesn't want to be there. which I think someone mentions it in the Cursed Films episode that like he didn't really want to do it, but he was broke or he needed the work. But he's giving it all he can, but it's just not very good.
Yeah.
I will say, though, I wouldn't necessarily classify this as my least favorite segment. So I don't know if we want to jump to that.
Really?
Well, yeah.
So,
Well, this is where it gets interesting because we have 2 and 3 left. So
Yeah. Do we want to talk about the good one or the bad one?
Let's hear your 3. What is it?
okay, so I'm going to preface what I'm about to say by saying that I think that both of the remaining ones are fine.
Sure.
I don't think one of them is bad. I think one is better than the other, and that is Joe Dante's It's a Good Life remake.
Yeah.
Okay.
Which is better just because, as with the Nightmare at 20,000 Feet one, the main characters like grow and change at the end.
Yep.
Which I think is important for these stories, because again, like I think I mentioned earlier, the closing narration on the episode It's a Good Life literally ends with Serling saying, "No comment here, no comment at all. This is just terrible."
I just wanted to introduce you to this child.
Yeah, exactly. And so this one, like at the end, the child is taken under the wing of the teacher, played by Kathleen Quinlan, who, Jesus Christ, was very attractive. And also you have the amazing Joe Dante set production and creature design throughout.
It's like, incredible.
Totally.
You have a baby Nancy Cartwright to tie it back to The Simpsons as one of the characters.
You think it was an accident you came here? He made it happen.
And I think that everyone in it is good. I think Kathleen Quinlan is good, but I think in particular Kevin McCarthy as Uncle Walt is great.
Yes.
I think all the like family members are good, but I think Kevin McCarthy like really understands the assignment in a way that nobody else does. And again,
the hat trick thing is killer.
Oh yeah, when he's like reaching in and doesn't know what's going to come. Oh, so good.
Oh yes, but the hat. Where's the hat? Oh.
Yeah. I mean, so this is all this is to say this was my favorite segment, like by a long shot. Like I really liked the George Miller segment, but I thought this was like, maybe it's just because I guess I really like Joe Dante, but everything felt like it was slotted into place. The tone was great, the production design was great, the music was great, the cinematography was great, the performances are great. It was just like everything about it was great. The story is maybe the thing that like I like the least. Like I'm kind of just like like whatever. It's not a particularly interesting story, and so maybe that's where like Nightmare at 20,000 Feet like ekes it out, because I don't really know what this one is necessarily trying to say, but just like watching it, especially after the 2 previous ones that I felt were kind of a slog, I was like, oh, this is cool. This is fun. This is something I haven't really seen.
I mean, what that one's trying to say is discipline your kids. Basically.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think that's right. Is that you have to set boundaries.
You have to set boundaries. Kids need limits. And I will say that I think the reason I like 20,000 Feet better is I think the kid is less interesting in this one. I think like in this one, he's just a kid who does a couple of bad, like in the original episode, one of the first things that kid does is make a gopher with 3 heads that he then
kills it.
that he then kills.
Okay.
Like,
it's
like,
brutal.
He's a little bit younger and he's clearly just never had boundaries. And he's also maybe not old enough to go through that thing that kids go through where they develop, ethics and empathy. Yeah. They are very much tormented by this child that they have no control over and never have. And this kid's a little bit more developed to the point where he probably should have empathy. And maybe if they had written the story so that he was starting to develop that empathy a little bit more, I would have liked it a little bit more. Or started out a little more horrifying. I don't know. But like there's just a certain something missing from it that makes it, I mean, to be fair, makes it great, not amazing. You know what I mean? Yeah. It's still really, really, really good.
I think, and you know what, Matthew, like, again, I think I was thinking about this more in terms of, like, from a filmmaking perspective. I think this is the more interesting segment just because of the visual style.
I mean, if you cut it down to just production design, this is the one. Like, the house, the monsters, like
the
even
TV just opening up, and then the tornado cloud. Like, it's just nothing looks like this. Like, it's so fucking cool.
Even just the like upstairs hallway that's obviously from a black and white TV show is so great.
And like what the reveal on the sister with the no mouth.
Yeah, like, so good, so good. Yeah, it's just
to me, it's just so memorable. It's this weird thing, and we've talked about this a lot on the show too. Of like, Nightmare at 20,000 Feet is great, but I always think of the Simpsons segment, and not that the Simpsons segment is doing it better necessarily. Like I've said in other cases where I'm like, I think the Simpsons did it better, but it's just like I will always think of that segment tied to this, whereas the Simpsons version of this is different enough. Like it's just taking that core crux idea of like, giving a 10-year-old omniscient powers or whatever.
It's a lot closer to the episode,
and it is actually closer to the episode. Yeah.
Okay.
So because like the Jack in the Box is from the episode.
Yeah.
That makes sense.
Which is legitimately for a show from the 60s kind of horrifying. Like you never fully see it. You just see like a head with a hat, and then you see a shadow of a Jack in the Box that's clearly got a human head on it.
Interesting.
But like the way that everyone acts around the kid, like the kid is scarier. I think that's what it really boils down to. The kid in the show is scarier. You at no point believe this kid is ever going to be redeemed. And the adults fully realize they are never going to be able to escape. It's a scarier concept.
I would agree with that. But I think of the film segments, this one has the strongest Act 1, where you actually are introduced to the main character. You are introduced to the kid. You slowly realize what's going on. And it does actually have a proper ending, but I agree. The ending's just a little too neat and tidy and doesn't quite have that Twilight Zone feel. It's kind of a straightforward happy ending of like the teacher figures out how to solve the problem and leaves with the child, and the child seems like they're on a better path with this teacher. And it's like you really want a little bit of menace, like because she still has this omnipotent child, right?
Exactly.
And I mean, like I even was thinking almost like it was going to go in a different direction where she almost sees the potential for what you could do with an omnipotent child that you raise yourself. But they don't really go there with that. So,
but again, I still prefer that ending though, because as much as it's like this woman has now signed up for a lifelong assignment of dealing with this potentially psychotic, omnipotent child, people have at least learned and grown and changed, right? Whereas, again, the ending of the original show it just stops. It just stops, and everything's still terrible.
Exactly.
And but not only that,
but there's a sequel.
Not only that, this has, and you alluded to it, Matthew, it has a very young, not necessarily recognizable Nancy Cartwright in one of her earliest sort of film roles, which it's so funny because I didn't clock it right away. And it wasn't until I was writing something in my notebook and she delivered a line and I had like a light bulb. I was like, oh my God, that's Nancy Cartwright. And
she sometimes sounds a little bit like Bart Simpson in this.
Yeah,
for sure.
yeah, exactly. And
she has a little monologue at the end where you're like if you didn't know ahead of time, you might be like, that voice sounds familiar. And then she delivers this monologue about how the kid is terrible. And you're like, that is Bart Simpson right there.
He brought you here, just like he brought us here, and kept us here, just the way he'll keep you here. Maybe he'll get mad at you, like he did to his real sister, and cripple you and take away your mouth so you won't be able to yell at him anymore. Or maybe he'll do to you what he did to his real mother and father.
Time for you to go now, Ethel.
Yeah. She actually sounds more like her character in The Critic, because I don't know if you remember in The Critic, she plays Jay's sister. So she actually plays like a female character for one of the rare instances where she wasn't playing like a 10-year-old boy. But yeah, it was like, because I wasn't looking at the screen and I just heard the voice, that's when I was like, oh my God. And I remember that Nate told me she was in it. So everything sort of slotted into place. But it's so funny that she also like gets trapped in a cartoon and like,
little did she know that was going to be the rest of her life.
Yeah, literally will be trapped in a cartoon for the next 36 years. I love this segment. The visual artistry on display, like you can understand how, because this wasn't necessarily Dante's big break, because like he had already made The Howling, which is what the movie that I understand is sort of like his big break. And then he goes on to make Gremlins after this, and that's like the one that everybody knows, that one. Yeah. But it's like you can sort of see how a studio watching this would maybe go, hey, this guy's got some juice. We should maybe see what he can do if we actually give him like some money and a proper chance at making like a real movie, as it were.
Yeah, and I think his relationship with Spielberg is generally sort of like how he gets into the system is like, but yeah, I mean, he's, of all of them, he's the one who hasn't had his like biggest movie yet, you know, arguably.
Yeah.
And then he's also kind of the guy who like fades into obscure, like it's this weird thing of like he makes all these incredible movies and like he hasn't done anything in the last like 15 years, and it's sort of like, what's happened to him? Like
he's synonymous with the 80s, I think is the thing, is like these kinds of practical effects are incredible and I love them, but they're out of fashion, right?
Yeah,
you say that though, but I know he's directed a ton of TV in the past 10 years.
Okay, well there
you
go.
I looked this up yesterday. He's done like a dozen or something episodes of the Hawaii Five-0 reboot.
Okay.
And then like there's that new show, Witches of something, Salem, that show Salem. He did an episode of Legends of Tomorrow. Like he's done a ton of TV in the past decade.
So he's still working. But
Yeah.
Whenever a film podcast is like, whatever happened to this person? The answer is like always TV.
Yeah, pretty much. Pretty much.
Yeah. It just seems like I don't know. I feel like it feels to me anyway that he's like in director's jail, but doesn't have a reason to be because like as far as I can tell from his filmography, it's not like he has any like true colossal flops. I mean, John Landis is still making shit and like.
I mean, maybe he just got
talked
tired
about that.
Joe Dante, I mean, I have no inside baseball on this, but Joe Dante makes very visually distinct and very distinct storytelling choices in his films. And maybe he just got tired of the notes, you know? Like maybe he got tired of being told you can't do that by the money people. Yeah. That's totally a thing.
Kevin Feige should hire him to direct a weird Marvel movie, like how he got Sam Raimi to come back and do that one.
I'd watch that.
What was it? Doctor Strange. He did that weird Doctor Strange movie.
Madness.
Yeah, so there you go. There's a free tip for old Kev. Okay, well, should we talk about the last segment, Kick the Can? Hot take, I think this is the worst one.
I know a lot of people do. It's my biggest problem with it is that we talked about the prologue being tonally out of place. And
yeah, right.
And this one is like peak schmaltzy Spielberg in the middle of a horror movie. And as I understand, it was actually meant to be the last one. Which would have made sense to end on like a happy note, right?
Yeah.
But either way, I don't think it's terrible, and I think in many ways it's an improvement on the original episode, but also does not fit with any of the rest of the movie, which I think is a problem.
It's just that's why I think I disliked it so much. It's such a weird tonal shift, but not in that sort of like way of, again, talking about comedy and horror. Like it doesn't feel like we're sort of letting the audience ease down so that we can ramp everything back up again. It's just like so schmaltzy. Like Scatman's great in it because he's Scatman and he's the best.
Yeah.
But I don't know, man. I just was like, what am I watching? I think you're right, Matthew. Like it's peak Spielberg schmaltz, which is the stuff I don't like when he does that. Like that's my least favorite lane of his.
This is definitely a case for me of like Spielberg is too good of a filmmaker to make something that's fully bad. Like he just he's maybe
I mean like
maybe done that
the
once,
blocking's
right?
great and like you know
there are moments that get me emotionally even though it's schmaltzy, but like the part at the very end, I think, where the guy is asking the kid to take him with him, I was like, all right, you might have got me a little bit, Stevie. But
when Scatman looks at the cameras, like he'll get it eventually. Like
I like that moment.
Like you know, I'm not teary. I'm just there's something in my eyes. All you know, But I think that's again like the changes to the story are an improvement on the original, which I don't know if you guys watched it.
I don't know if I agree, actually. I like the ending better. So, like, Adam, in the original episode, I think probably the biggest story shift is that in the episode, they just turn into kids and then they run into the forest.
Yeah, they just disappear.
They just disappear.
Oh, so they don't turn back into adults.
No.
Right. And then the character who's left behind, the character who's left behind is like, take me with you. And then that's basically it.
Okay.
So in that way, I feel like that ending is more Twilight Zone-y, right?
Right.
In the sense of there is a little bit of like mystery and horror. So here's the other big difference. There's no Mr. Bloom in the episode. So Scatman's character does not exist in the episode. And instead, the main character is the one who's instigating all of this.
Okay.
Yeah, like the main old man.
Yeah.
And so in the episode, you're always kind of like, is he just crazy? Is he actually losing his mind? Because everyone around him is sort of like, well, this happens eventually, you know, people start acting weird, and then that's kind of the beginning of the end, and blah, blah, blah. And then at the end, the Conroy character is the one who's like, take me with you. And he thinks the kids are the old people, but it's never confirmed in the show.
Yeah.
So it's so there's sort of like enough ambiguity that it kind of offsets the sweetness of it, I think.
Right.
Whereas in this, it's very much like, nope, it's very clear from the beginning that Mr. Bloom is magical and that all of this stuff is true. And there's a kind of Peter Pan-ish quality to all of it. That
I prefer that, to be honest. Like,
really?
Fair.
Okay.
I very much prefer the ending of the segment, which ends with all of the kids, these old people who've turned into kids, being like, we already lived our lives. Like, we can just recapture our youth, but live our lives. Like, we don't want to give anything up. So they all become old people again, but they've all recaptured their youthful spirit, except for Mr. Conroy, who's kicking the can, desperately still trying to find it. Whereas I just find the end of the episode to be such a bummer, man.
It is.
They all turn into kids and they run into the forest, and the administrator of the old folks home is like, we got to go find the kids. And the old man is like, you'll never find them. It's
pretty much.
It's so depressing. And so
I agree that the moral, I think, is way better in the movie because it's a more interesting idea. It's really about recapturing the youth of the mind and not the youth of the body, and making that distinction, which I think is really smart.
And you get the nice sort of tag of Scatman going to another old folks home, implying that this is...
See, I didn't like that, though.
Which is like,
really?
Which is like next door is what it feels like.
No kidding. It's
What's
like,
next door to the next
we happen to live in the old folks home neighborhood.
The old folks home district.
Exactly.
And you think that at some point someone's gonna be like, this guy shows up at old folks homes and at least one kid goes missing every time.
Well, he's got The Shining. That's why,
I think the thing is about that is that it makes it into something that's strictly magical, right?
Right.
Which I don't think is totally true to the Twilight Zone vibe. And also it kind of falls into that like unfortunate trope of like the magical Negro sort of thing.
Oh,
it definitely. Which that was
sucks.
a little off-putting.
And that's not in the original. So in a sense, it's like I actually think the original has aged better than the movie version for that reason.
That's honestly probably fair. We've definitely recognized and moved past that trope a little bit. So I don't know. I don't think the segment is bad. I just think it's out of place.
Yeah.
But it's still like
I agree with that.
3 out of 4 in the segments here.
I want to now go to our favorite little part of the show we call the parts that seem like Simpson jokes but aren't. I wouldn't describe this film as one that is... I mean, I guess there's some humor in it, but none of it feels very Simpsons-y. I mean, there's definitely some Tex Avery-style humor in the Joe Dante segment, but was there anything to you, gentlemen, that felt Simpsons-y? Because...
I actually think the whole Kick the Can segment has a bunch of sort of Simpsons-y moments to it.
Yeah, maybe.
Like, particularly the beginning part where you have all the people listening to the like Vitamin Man, and then they start talking about sex, and you get all the close-ups of the older folks who are like practically like licking their lips, Like,
that's
cartoonish.
True.
What? Sex? What's so unappealing about hearing your elderly father talk about sex?
But then the other thing that definitely jumped out to me was Mr. Bloom's precious antique can. That he like pulls a can out of his coat, and it's like
and it's
super shiny.
Yeah.
So those were the things that jumped out at me. But
I wouldn't say there's anything very like specifically Simpsons-y, but there's a lot of stuff in it that like that where he pulls a can out of his obviously jacket pocket that doesn't have a can in it. That's very cartoony. Most noticeably in the Joe Dante one where he's pulling cartoon characters into real life, but like there's a lot of moments like that in the rest of it too where cartoony stuff happens. But I wouldn't call any of it necessarily Simpsons-y specifically.
Totally. Well, in terms of performance, would it shock you to find out that this film was fine? It did fine.
Yeah.
I mean, it was made for $10 million. It grossed worldwide $42 million. So, like, a decent return on investment, but not what the studio was hoping for. They really thought we're going to make something that's going to make a ton of money and going to be so cheap to produce, and we can do these every year. And obviously, they didn't make any more of these. There was the reboot series shortly after this, like a couple years later. Nate and I sort of read conflicting reports as to whether or not, that series exists because of the movie or in spite of the movie. It's not super clear, but I mean, there was a reboot 2 years later. So obviously it was, maybe that was possible because of the cultural.
I mean, what I was reading was that it was partly because of Spielberg's other movies that were kind of in the same vein or showed like an appetite for supernatural and sci-fi stuff like E.T. and you have Poltergeist.
That makes a little more sense.
So like those sort of are proof of concept, even if the movie doesn't do as well as they were hoping, I guess.
Yeah, I think also like there's a whole like hunger for genre-y stuff throughout the 80s. So I think that bringing back the Twilight Zones just makes sense. I think most people involved in the movie, I mean, again, I don't know any of these people personally, but my understanding is most of the people involved in the movie are like, I don't want to remember that.
I mean, there's literally no special features on the Blu-ray, which I have to assume
Wow.
is because everyone is like, no, we do not want to.
don't
Like,
talk
no
about
one
that.
wants to talk about this
Yeah.
thing.
Yeah.
Which I
fair
can
enough.
understand.
And even
I kind of
even in that
agree with them.
Even in that Cursed Films episode that you and I watched, which is honestly, it's not great, but it's really good. There's only one guy from the production, and he comes off a little bit like he tells this whole story, and at the end, he kind of cries over the fact that his career is over, not that 3 people died. A little bit.
Well, and not only that, I looked it up. He went on to work with Landis on Landis's preceding films.
Oh. Yeah.
So it's like, it's not like he was so, taken aback that he was like, I'm never going to work. Again, I don't want to judge the man. Like, he is clearly visibly shaken by what happened. He's the production designer. I don't think he's at fault at all for what happened.
No.
Not that we need to litigate any of that. But if I were involved, I would be pretty torn up.
Yeah, it'd be like,
well.
it'd be like on my IMDb profile, and I would never talk about it. And which is what I understand everyone else to basically do.
In terms of the top of the year, unsurprisingly, this didn't crack the top 10 that year, though it does include at number 5, War Games.
Mm-hmm.
At number 4, John Landis's Trading Places.
Right, which actually does have some in common with this segment that he does.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And what he's thinking about at this moment.
Exactly. Number 3 is Flashdance. Number 2 is the Simpsons' own James L. Brooks's Terms of Endearment. And unsurprisingly, at number 1, Return of the Jedi.
Right.
And I was just curious, like, okay, well, I understand that this movie isn't, it's not cracking the top 10 for the year, but how did it do the week it was released? And it comes in at number 4, behind, believe it or not, Porky's 2. Yes, this movie was beaten out by the sequel to Porky's. Superman 3, one of the worst Superman movies. And number 1 was obviously Return of the Jedi.
Wow.
So.
But IP, they're all IP.
Yeah. Exactly. And no Academy Award nominations. The critical reviews are unkind. I would say, I didn't pull them because it's long, but Roger Ebert actually quite wisely in his review, he reviews each segment individually and sort of gives them a star ranking accordingly. And his sort of align with ours. So I mean, I don't think we're, breaking any new ground. I think the general consensus about this film echoes what we feel. So, I mean, that leads to the question of like, do the strengths outweigh the weaknesses? Would you guys recommend people check this movie out or not?
Oh boy.
I think it's an interesting artifact. I think if you are, a Spielberg completionist or perhaps a Joe Dante or George Miller completionist, there's definitely stuff to like here. I think there's more good than bad. Like, I think when I watched it yesterday, I gave it a 3 out of 5 on Letterboxd. So I think it's
same here.
I think it's fine. I think that if you have, I don't want to say any sensitivity, because I obviously have sensitivity to the things that have happened, but like, I think for a lot of people, it's just going to be unwatchable.
Yep.
And
certainly that when you know what you know, watching that segment, like it cannot help but color your viewing of it and your judgment of it. And
I guess my problem with it is I want to say yes because it's such a weird artifact of the early 1980s, but it's also kind of bland. The movie is almost worth watching just because of how many people are in it.
Yeah.
And not just the people playing the main characters. No movie with Dick Miller in it can be totally bad, even though he's only in it for like 4 minutes at the beginning of segment 3. And Kevin McCarthy and Helen Shaw's in this. Bill Quinn is in this. It's such a who's who of like 60s and 70s and early 80s character talent that it's worth revisiting almost entirely for that, even if it is sort of hard to get through parts of it. Yeah.
It's a real mixed bag. It's just a really weird experiment in a lot of ways with a lot of big ideas, big voices, big swings, and a good chunk of them do not work out. And there's a horrible tragedy in the backstory of it.
Yeah.
So it's just a really weird artifact.
It's a mixed bag, but it's not like it's a mix of apples and oranges. It's like apples and Wolverines, Like it's
put that on the box.
It's so tonally discordant and so difficult to get through that one segment that I think it's worth watching, but like your mileage is going to vary, to say the very least.
But I think it's also, it draws attention to the difference between films and television, and the sense that like the beauty of a television show is you can have an anthology television show because each week you can do something different and it doesn't feel like it's tonally discordant necessarily because you're not watching them back to back. But when you take 4 completely different types of segments and stick them all together, you get whiplash and you're like, what is happening? Like, how did these all fit together? Like, and I understand the desire not to just do 4 that are all very spooky or all that are like really sci-fi. Like, you want to have some diversity, but it makes it kind of difficult to watch as a result. So
I think that's true of most anthology movies as well, right?
Yeah.
There's
It
very
works
few.
much better on The Simpsons.
yeah.
Totally it does. To be fair, I can't think of very many anthology films off the top of my head, but I also can't think of any that don't have at least one kind of like segment, you know?
Right.
Totally.
So,
well, Matthew, as a Twilight Zone fan, is this important if you like the Twilight Zone, or
should people just go and watch the original segments?
So again, I think several of these segments do offer improvements on their originals. So if you're a Twilight Zone completionist, yeah, absolutely check it out. I think that you'll always be better served by watching the shows, though. I think, as with Star Trek, and this is maybe a controversial opinion as someone who holds like Wrath of Khan and An Undiscovered Country as being 2 like all-time favorite movies, I think the Twilight Zone is better on TV. Yeah. And I think that's where it belongs, and I think that's where it should be and will flourish. Trying to make it into a movie was a noble experiment that I think was probably always destined to not fail, but to not succeed. And to not be the smash hit they hoped for.
Yeah. And the thing we haven't really like come right out and addressed is the fact that Rod Serling was not involved. Like, maybe that's part of it, right? Is that like the magic of that show was his contributions and his understanding of what he was trying to say and how he was trying to say it. And by bringing in, sure, these are 4 hotshot directors, but like they don't necessarily understand this world as well as the creator does. And so for them to step in and think, oh, well, we can do it bigger and better because we've now got the money, maybe that just shows like these things are best left to their...
I don't necessarily disagree with what you're saying, but I will say that, to be fair, he had been dead for 7 years.
So. No, I understand. I understand that. Like, it's very. I keep telling you, he's 73 years old and he's dead. Yeah. No, I understand he couldn't be involved.
I think the thing is that like Rod Serling is very much like an essayist, and you can really read, I think, these episodes as essays. And so from that standpoint, like, you know, of course, every director, every writer has their own voice, and that's very important. But like some things are more readily adaptable. And I think you need an essayist to adapt the Twilight Zone. You need someone, you know, like we mentioned Jordan Peele earlier. He's a great example of someone who is an essayist, right? Like he has that same sort of approach to his work that I think is really well suited to it. Again, I have not seen his take on the series, but I can see why people thought Jordan Peele would be the right person for that.
Right. Our other question, Matthew, is we always like to, when we wrap things up, sort of do an extra credit or something to pair the film with. I think we're all sort of saying you could maybe give this film a miss, but is there something that people could watch maybe instead of this that could give similar vibes or that maybe does the same idea better? Is something coming to mind?
No, I mean, honestly, just go watch any version of the Twilight Zone from TV would be the best option for this. Or, I mean, honestly, go find any of the better anthology, like go find the 90s Outer Limits. Go find, you know, the recent Guillermo del Toro Cabinet of Curiosity. Like, go find something else that is in the same vein. I think what you were talking about with Serling being an essayist is pretty apt. I think that Serling always seemed to start from a place of what do I want to say and then how am I going to say it? Whereas I think this movie is very much like, we just want to remake the ones we liked, which is not the same thing, you know?
No.
And I think that the recent Twilight Zone has a couple of very good episodes that are very much like, I have something to say, how am I going to say that?
Right.
So I think the better version of any of these anthology shows would just be the thing to go find. So like original Twilight Zone, 90s Outer Limits, Black Mirror. Yeah. Would be a great one to check out instead of this or with this or because of this. If you want to stay in the movies, just go watch anything else from Spielberg within like 3 to 5 years of this. It's almost all better.
Right.
Yeah, totally. What about you, Nate? What comes to mind for you?
So this kind of is a little bit roundabout, but Being John Malkovich. I actually
love that movie.
It's one of my top 4 on Letterboxd. I think Charlie Kaufman's similarly an essayist of sorts, I think, and loves these sort of like what if questions. A lot of his stories are just like, what if there was a company that did this? Right. That's like this supernatural thing that like would change the way we all live as humans, but also it would reveal something about the human condition and so on, right? And Being John Malkovich is a perfect example of that. I feel like that is actually very Serling-esque. And another fun fact about Kaufman is that he actually sort of started in the comedy world and actually wrote spec scripts for The Simpsons. And was never accepted as a writer. And he actually got his first writing gig in the TV and film world on Get a Life from David Merkin.
Oh, interesting.
Former
I didn't know
Simpsons
that.
showrunner. So there you go.
Fascinating. Huh. Cool.
Yeah. What about you, Adam?
So this is a weird thing to recommend because like I only saw it for the first time like a couple weeks ago, but John Carpenter's They Live. I don't know. There's something about that movie that kind of feels Twilight Zone-y to me, and that like
that's a great
weird
call
and
out, actually.
Science fiction-y, but like it has a thesis and it's trying to say something, and that's what Carpenter's so good at doing, is like using genre to tell a larger story. So it's not necessarily like my favorite Carpenter movie. I've only seen it once, so I don't even know it that well. But as I was watching it, I was just like, man, this feels of a piece with the Twilight Zone, especially the ending. Like, yeah,
Totally.
so that would be my pick.
That's a great.
I love that.
That's a great call out. And like, I don't know that it's my favorite John Carpenter movie either, but it's easily one of the ones that has the most to say, which I think
Yes, exactly.
brings it into what you're saying about being of a piece with the Twilight Zone.
Yeah. And it's a fun watch because it is wild. It's a wild movie.
It is a weird ass movie, but you kind of can't go wrong with Carpenter. But
It's also insanely quotable. Like it's
it's great. Well, that brings us to the end of the episode. Before we go, Matthew, thank you so much for joining us. It's been such a pleasure having you. Is there anything you want to plug before we go?
Yeah, so I'm a freelance film critic and writer, so I write for That Shelf, which is where this podcast is from, but I also write for exclaim.ca and a few other places, and I'm the co-host of the Awesome Friday podcast. The easiest way to find all of that stuff is to check out my personal portfolio website, which is stretched.ca, or search for Awesome Friday Podcast anywhere that podcasts are. I've made sure it's in all of those places, so yeah.
Amazing. Well, thank you, dear listener, for joining us for another episode of the Springfield Googleplex, the movie podcast for Simpson fans. As we say every week, if you enjoyed what you heard, please leave us a review and share this episode with the Simpson fans and film buffs in your life. It really does make a difference. And we're starting to actually see some growth here, which is very, very exciting. And we want to keep it going. So please continue to share this if you know people who will enjoy it. And in the meantime, Nate?
We'll see you around the Plex.
See you around the Plex. And that's it. There we go. Did I ever tell you, Nate, that I met John Landis?
Oh, God, no.
Yeah. I met him at TIFF. My first year of TIFF was when they debuted the 3D version of Thriller. And so I got to sit in on the sound check. And I met him very, very briefly. I just introduced myself and said hi. At this point, I didn't know about all of this.
Sure.
But everything I had seen of his, I liked. So I was like, oh, cool, it's John Landis. And then...
Well, yeah, I mean, Thriller, sure. We didn't even mention Thriller.
Then I discovered all of this and was like, oh, boy.
Yeah.
So, whoa.